In February, in Boston, there was a parade for Woodrow Wilson. There were a group of picketers, and they were arrested and jailed at the Charles Street Jail, and they were the last women jailed for the vote. They also lit fires with over barrels lighting his speeches, and those women were jailed as well. They were on the Boston Common. For women who had survived jail, similar when I talked about wearing white and being in a uniform color that everyone would recognize you, the other thing that the suffragists in England thought about actually was that these women should be decorated. They have survived jail. They have survived force feeding as these horrible conditions.
Fredie Kay is founder and president of the Women's Suffrage Celebration Coalition of Massachusetts, the short version of which is Suffrage100MA, or Massachusetts. Ms. Kay began her legal career at Goodwin Procter LLP, after which she served as Deputy Legal Counsel to Governors Michael Dukakis and William Weld. Ms. Kay was appointed director of the Massachusetts Office of Dispute Resolution, where she served from 1993 to 2000. Fredie earned her JD at Georgetown University Law Center and her MPA at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. Please join me in welcoming Fredie Kay.
So for today, I'd like to talk a little bit about the history. I'm going to try very hard in a short and a not too long a time to take us from the beginning, if you will, a little bit with Abigail Adams, right up through when the 19th Amendment was adopted in August of 1920, almost 100 years ago, keeping in mind that while the 19th Amendment enabled all women to vote, supposedly, we are well aware that, unfortunately, Jim Crow laws in the South, in particular, prohibited women of color from voting, and that also other groups as well have been blocked and have not had access to voting. And this 100th centennial, this 100th anniversary, is a great opportunity for all groups to be examining and all of us to be examining what different elements of society have gone through to try to have access to the vote. So I think it's very, very important for us to honor and to celebrate and commemorate all these terrific men and women who fought so hard for the vote. Some date it for 72 years, and I'll put a plus on that because it was more. But in order for women to take the vote, to get the vote, it took decades and decades and decades of persistence and dedication. And remember, it was the men who had to vote for it to make it happen. It just took them forever. So finally, they were casting the votes. They were only one casting the votes, so it took them a long time to figure it out. So there is so much history here, I think, that we were never taught. We were not brought up with this history. Certainly I wasn't, and was pleased to learn it. And part of the importance of this centennial, I think, is the opportunity we have to learn this incredible, incredible history. It's a bit like it was just erased. Women, frankly, being erased from history. And I think it's so important that we have this opportunity with the centennial to bring that to light as much as we can. I would like to start with Abigail Adams and her letter to her husband. And I know that many of us know the beginning of it, at least, when he was in Philadelphia in March of 1776. And she wrote, "Remember the ladies, and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation." I'm sorry to say that his response was not good, and it was not encouraging or supportive, and he sort of responded with, "Are you kidding? Of course we're going to keep the power." And it was very disheartening. Also, the Grimke sisters, Angelina and Sarah, abolitionists who moved from the South where their family owned slaves, and they grew up with slaves, and they moved to the North to fight slavery with William Lloyd Garrison. They called also for women to have the vote and to be able to speak in public in mixed audiences. And at the time, when women spoke in front of audiences, that was a new, different, and unheard of thing. Women were not allowed to speak in front of audience, and they called them mixed audiences, or worse, frankly. If men and women were sitting together, women were not supposed to be speaking in front of them. So they were breaking barriers. When the Grimke sisters spoke in front of mixed audiences, they were absolutely breaking barriers, and people didn't like it. And so many people threw rotten fruit at them and food and all kinds of things to discourage them from doing it, and basically wanted to send them home and say, this is not your sphere to be in the public sphere. And it was a total silencing of voices. They did not have voices. And we are thankful to the Grimke sisters for breaking down a barrier, or starting to, and many more to come. So a primary goal of Suffrage 100MA is to bring to light all this history, and also so that people will appreciate and exercise their vote in greater numbers. We are hoping that people will learn things that they may not have known, and will recognize and realize how much we need to appreciate our vote, because we didn't have to work for decades upon decades, nor did we have to go to jail to get the vote, which I'll talk about in a little bit. So two women in particular come to mind that I want to speak about for a few moments, and they were so important to this movement, and they come after the Grimke sisters. And one is Lucretia Mott, and the other is Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Lucretia Mott was born and raised on our own Nantucket, and I'm thinking of our friends here who've come from Martha's Vineyard, so nearby in Nantucket. And she was a Quaker, really important to her upbringing, and there's a theme with many suffragists, not all of them, but many were Quakers, where they were brought up with equality in their families and in their background. When she was brought up, it was amazing how she was born in 1793. She spent her childhood on Nantucket. Her father was a sea captain who would go off on trips, often for months at a time, and in some cases years. And this was common for many of the people living in Nantucket. And there was one time where he went off for 3 years, and they had no word for him. They didn't know if he was alive. And when he appeared back at home, they hardly recognized him. He was thin, he was gone, he was older. He had had horrific challenges and journeys through that time. So at that point, he decided that he would stay home and change so that they would move to Boston. But while he was away, it meant that her mother was running the household alone. And there were many, many women on Nantucket who were in this situation where the men were not around. And it also meant that there was no money coming in. So they didn't have a means to live. And her mother was extremely resourceful and decided to sell goods in their home. But how did she get them? She would travel to Boston, not easy, come to Boston to buy some things and sell them in her home. I believe that Lucretia was about 10 years old when her mother came up for a big trip and came back on, and it was Lucretia, who was the second oldest, but took the leadership role in the family amongst the children. I believe there were 4 others. And she took care of the kids. She fed them. She did the chores. She made everything made sure everything was taken care of. So when her mother came back home, she was stunned, actually, I think, and so pleased to find that she could leave the care of the children and the household in Lucretia's hands, and she did such a great job. So she was clearly a very accomplished and wonderful person. When they moved to Boston, they decided to send Lucretia to a Quaker school. At that point, he was making money as a merchant himself here in Boston. They were doing very well. Lucretia was sent to a school that was pretty far away, and she was 13 years old. By the time she was 15, she had mastered all the courses, had graduated from the program, and was teaching. They hired her to teach. She was clearly incredibly brilliant. She also met her future husband there, and they were already starting to date, as we would say today. So the Quaker Church was everything to Lucretia and her family, and ultimately she became a minister and a wonderful speaker. People would fill houses to come hear her. They were abolitionists. William Lloyd Garrison came to visit, and this was now where Lucretia Mott was now married. In 1840, she was 47 years old, had raised 5 children. She was a leader in the Philadelphia Society. She and her husband had moved to Philadelphia, of the Friends of the Quakers. She and her husband were chosen to represent the Philadelphia branch of the American Anti-Slavery Society, and they were chosen to represent that group at the World Anti-Slavery Convention in England. So they crossed the ocean to go to this convention. And there she met Elizabeth Cady Stanton. What happened to the two of them was very interesting. But I'm going to diverge over to Elizabeth Cady Stanton for a minute so you can tell about these two incredible women who met. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was born in 1815 in Johnstown, New York, and she lived until 1902. And I will mention that she was president of the National Women's Suffrage Association until 1892, when she stepped down at the age of 77. Susan B. Anthony took over at that time, and in 1900, when she was 80, she stepped down. So these were women who had long, incredibly productive lives. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, in her case, the story has a lot to do with her father. Whereas Lucretia Mott, her father was away for so much of it, and she was trained, if you will, with her mother. The story of Elizabeth Cady Stanton has a lot to do with her father, who was around. He was a lawyer, he was a judge, a member of the state legislature, then elected to U.S. Congress, and became a justice of the state Supreme Court. Elizabeth would often listen while he was with clients in their home. He had a law practice in his home with law books, and Elizabeth would overhear his conversations frequently with women and the frustration that these women had, the heartbreak, because of the property laws and other limitations on their lives. And often it had to do with the inheritance laws, which meant that if a husband died, the property did not go to the wives, it went to the sons. And sometimes the sons would decide to just sell the property and kick mom out, literally. So these were horrible situations. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was really upset about it, and it certainly got into her to be concerned about the rights for women and what they had. In those days, because married women could not own property, that even applied to your own personal items, your jewelry. And a famous story was that she had a coral necklace that she loved that her father had given her. And in those days, you might have one precious piece of jewelry, and in this case, it was a coral necklace from her father. And her friends knew how sensitive she was about the laws regarding women's rights, and they would tease her. And they told her, you know, when you get married, that necklace is going to belong to your husband. It's not going to belong to you. And your husband can do whatever he wants with it. He can sell it. He could even sell it for tobacco and smoke it up. And that was just so painful to Elizabeth. And if you think about it, she thought it was her own, that it was from her father. No, it would not be owned by her if she got married. So one day, Elizabeth walked into her father's law study with a pair of scissors, and he asked her, "What are you doing?" And she said, "I am here to cut up all of these horrific laws that you're telling me about because they should not exist, so I'm going to cut them up." And he explained to her that there are copies of these laws all across the state of New York, and so that's not a very practical way to do it. And I think at that time he also talked to her about Albany, New York, and the state legislature, and how she could go about potentially changing the laws, but cutting them up was not going to be a solution. So fast forward up to 1840 and this anti-slavery, World Anti-Slavery Convention in London, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton was recently married, and it was their honeymoon where they went to England for this World Anti-Slavery Convention. When they arrived, there turned out to be a huge debate about whether women could vote at the convention. And these women had crossed the ocean. They had been designated, and now they arrived and told, "Oh, no, you're going to have to sit in the back, and you may not participate." There was a huge debate about it. They finally took a vote, and 90% of the participants voted to have women not participate. So having crossed the ocean, they sit in the back. A late arrival was William Lloyd Garrison, and when he arrived and learned that the women were not allowed to vote, he was so outraged, he joined them in the women's section and gave up his vote, which was really something. What was interesting, of course, was that's when Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony met at this convention, and you could just imagine that they were sitting and talking, and at some point, I think they turned to each other and said, we need a women's rights convention because of recognizing and the need to recognize the importance of getting rights for women, and here they were working against slavery, which was so important. Many American women at this time were beginning to chafe against what historians have called the cult of true womanhood. That is the idea that only true woman was a pious, submissive wife and mother concerned exclusively with home and family. And it truly was a case of women being viewed not as individual adults with agency. Men were in the public world, they were in the business world, the academic world. Women were to be home with children, and that was it. So that was something that was addressed as well at the famous Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. And this was the first women's rights convention. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott had talked about this in England in 1840. It took until 1848. Now Elizabeth Cady Stanton and her husband have moved from Boston to Seneca Falls. Lucretia Mott has a sister, a relative, I'm not exactly sure it was a sister, in Seneca Falls who was having a baby, and she went to be with her to help her. So she was there for a short period of time. And as women sometimes do, they quickly met. They had tea together, and this idea of tea was popular because they could have tea together, and if men came through wondering, what are you women up to? They're, oh, we're just having tea, and then plot and plan other more dramatic things. So in this case, they decided to plan for a convention. And what was interesting was Lucretia Mott, who was a bit older than Elizabeth Cady Stanton, she was the draw, which means that they knew if they could hold this convention while she was in town, which meant quickly, because she wasn't going to be there for many days, that would attract many people to come to this convention. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was much less well known at that point. So within days, they put together this incredible convention. And one of the important outcomes of the convention was this idea of agency, that women were not just a part of women and children, that they were of their own. And you'll see sometimes the Declaration of Independence put up where all men are created equal, and at Seneca Falls it says all men, and it inserts and women are created equal to give agency. One of the major debates that went on at the Seneca Falls Convention was Elizabeth Cady Stanton. She was the main drafter, but they were all involved in drafting their wish list, what they wanted, which they called the Declaration of Sentiments, based on the Declaration of Independence. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton insisted on including the right to vote. Lucretia Mott was not enamored with that idea. It was a little bit about what we hear sometimes today, which is that's too much. If we ask for that, it could jeopardize everything else, and we don't want to do that, so we really shouldn't go that far. Maybe we should just kind of stick with the basics, if you will. Frederick Douglass was also at this convention, and he agreed with, and he was in his 30s, a young man, and he agreed with Elizabeth Cady Stanton that it was important and a core value that women needed to have the vote in order to have representation, that they would have this ability to change the laws and have a say in the laws that were governing them. So he helped her convince the convention to include votes for women in the Declaration of Sentiments. What's interesting is all of the other items in the Declaration of Sentiments were adopted unanimously, except for the votes for women. That was not adopted unanimously, but it was adopted by a majority vote, and it was included. Unfortunately, it meant it sort of foretold the difficulty they were going to have with this issue going forward. So that was 1848, the Seneca Falls Convention, and also coming out of the idea of women having agency and women speaking in mixed audiences, et cetera. 1850, 2 years later, was the first national women's rights convention because there were more people. It was now people from around the country. And that was held in our very own Worcester, Massachusetts, another thing that many of us don't know. And in that convention, there were 1,000 delegates, 11 states, and 2 days in 1850. It was October 23rd, 1850. Lucretia Mott and Lucy Stone were the two organizers of that. Lucy Stone, also from Massachusetts, they were the leaders. And Sojourner Truth of Florence, Massachusetts, attended that convention as well. And that was her first recorded appearance as a social reformer. She lived in Florence in a utopian community at the time. And she was, of course, remembered for her speech, Ain't I a Woman? And for many of these people, we do have panels and more information about them. And of course, there are many, many books to read. So in 1850 and again in 1851, there were conventions in Worcester, this National Women's Rights Convention. 1852 was held in Syracuse, and that one was presided over by Lucretia Mott. And then it was held elsewhere for a total of about 10 years, and it paused. They didn't do them again when the Civil War was on the brink. I also want to mention a name that may be familiar to you, Amelia Bloomer. She attended the 1848 Seneca Falls Convention, and as you may recall, she popularized bloomers. So women at this time are walking around in dresses that are all the way to the ground. We have Eileen wearing one today where they're really hard to clean and they're heavy and they don't give you mobility. And they wanted more freedom. So the idea of bloomers, which was sort of large pantaloons, you might call them, with a tunic over it that was shorter than their dresses to the floor so that they could move and have freedom. Unfortunately, as might be predicted, they drew jeers and scorn from men and boys. And they were a distraction when they gave speeches. Sound familiar? Issues where their focus became on their clothes and not what they were saying. And it meant that speeches, as Susan B. Anthony in particular wore them on occasion and just gave up and said, it's not worth it. I can't get what we would say, I can't get my message through because all they want to talk about is what I'm wearing. Very, very frustrating. Another thing that Amelia Bloomer is famous for is that in addition to promoting bloomers for women, she introduced Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton in May of 1851 in Seneca Falls, and there's a wonderful statue of the three of them meeting in Seneca Falls. And they were all together at the second National Women's Rights Convention in Worcester in 1851. So at the Worcester Convention, they demanded the right to vote, the right to own property in their own name. And I'm sure many of you, how many remember when women couldn't own property or certainly couldn't get a credit card in your own name, you couldn't open an account in your own name, you needed a co-signer, you needed your husband. Those things lasted for so many years. And they certainly came up in many of our lifetimes that we can remember. They also wanted to be able to be admitted to higher education, to medicine, the ministry, and other professions. Many newspapers heaped scorn on the convention. A few newspapers, such as the Massachusetts Spy, whose editor was the husband of one of the convention's supporters, he published positive reports about the convention, but most accounts were scornful and hostile. The New York Herald, edited by a strong opponent, made fun of the speaker's appearance, demeanor, and worst. In the Herald's version, the convention and demands of the women present were ridiculous and at a deeper level subversive. So I'm going to skip over some of this because I want to get to try to get us up to 1920. But the articles that were written were horrible. They were writing about these women, claiming that they wanted to abolish laws, abolish society, abolish the Bible, and all kinds of things. But the interesting thing was those negative newspaper articles was a great example of news is good in the sense that it publicized their issues, and more people did join the effort, having heard, even if it's scornful, from these horrible accounts. So they were thankful that they got reported, at least, so that more people could know about it. It drew attention to their issues and their cause of women's rights, and it helped win converts to the cause. And as you may know, in August 2018 was Lucy Stone's 200th birthday, and we unveiled her display panel at our Women's Equality Day event at the Swan Boats. So I'd like to say a few words about Lucy Stone from Massachusetts. She was from West Brookfield, born in 1818 and lived until 1893. And the key organizer of this key national convention. She founded the American Women's Suffrage Association. She was editor of the Woman's Journal, the most influential national publication advocating women's suffrage. Supported by state and state efforts she supported state efforts to enable a federal constitutional amendment. So the issue was, how were women going to get the vote? And you could try to get the vote by going state by state to change the Constitution within states, or you could try to get a federal amendment. And there was a huge debate about this issue between many groups over the years. She was in favor of supporting getting it by state, with the idea that the more states that adopt it, the stronger the argument will be to have a constitutional amendment if they can point to all these states where it's been adopted. It also means that women in those states would have political power. If you obtain the right to vote in these states, that was federal and state elections. So it meant presidential candidates were aware that these women would be lobbying them to support a constitutional amendment for women. So the more states where women had the vote, the more they could influence who their senators were and so forth on national level, as well as presidential candidates. So they would want a presidential candidate who was going to support getting a constitutional amendment. Lucy Stone was the first woman from Massachusetts to graduate from college, and she went to Oberlin. She did not want to marry and give up her rights. She was very, very conscious of that, but she met Henry Blackwell, and he pursued her for 2 years and really wanted to get married, and he pursued her and talked about options, and she finally agreed to marry him when they had created an agreement whereby she would keep her financial and personal independence and keep her name. So she kept her name as Lucy Stone, the first person that we know of in the country to do so. And women today who keep their name when they get married are often called Stoners in honor of Lucy Stone. After 10 years of these annual women's rights conventions in various parts of the country, there was one year where they didn't have one in 1857, by 1860, they stopped having the conventions. They were on the brink of the Civil War, which broke out in 1861. So the conventions ended. There were organizations being formed around suffrage, the American Equal Rights Association, and several others. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony formed the Women's Suffrage Association of America, and that was a split when Lucy Stone did not join them. In New England, I do want to mention Abby Kelly Foster of Worcester. She formed the New England Women's Suffrage Association, and she was also at the Worcester conventions. And Abby Kelly Foster, and we do have a panel about her, was an amazing woman who was very strong abolitionist, as well as a strong women's rights advocate for suffrage as well. Julia Ward Howe was elected president of the group, the New England Women's Suffrage Association, and also, as you know, wrote the Battle Hymn of the Republic. And Lucy Stone was on the executive committee. So this was a very powerful group. I'll just mention a little bit more about Abby Kelly Foster, that she was a Quaker, a teacher, a speaker for William Lloyd Garrison. She spoke at Oberlin College, and that's actually how Lucy Stone, when Lucy Stone was in college, she heard Abby Kelly Foster from her own state of Massachusetts speaking, and that's what got Lucy Stone energized and activated to become active in this cause as well. And also I'll mention that Abby Kelly Foster, she and her husband's home in Worcester became a stop on the Underground Railroad. I mentioned Julia Ward Howe, who wrote the Battle Hymn of the Republic, and her husband was 18 years older than she was, and he was the director of the Perkins Institute for the Blind and an abolitionist, but he was not very excited about his wife having independence. and he wanted to have all the spotlight on him and did not want her to have any of the spotlight. And it wasn't until he passed away that she got to flourish even more. And Julia Ward Howe attended a meeting where Lucy Stone spoke in 1868, and that inspired her. So as you can see, all these women have inspired each other through the years, which is so wonderful. And I'm going to fast forward and just mention a parade I'm going to talk about in March of 1913. The Massachusetts delegation carried a banner with the image of Julia Ward Howe at that parade in Washington, which was, I think, a tribute to her and all that she had contributed. So 1869 began a 21-year schism, which was very sad, between the movement. It was over the 14th and 15th Amendments debates that were added to the Constitution, and it created a terrible rift in the suffragists, mainly between Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony and Lucy Stone. And it was a very difficult and horrible rift, if you will, and there were different positions, and part of it was because the question was, in amending the Constitution, where for the first time the word men was going to be added. It had never been in there before, and it meant that African American men would potentially have the right to vote before women would have the right to vote, and many felt that they had been fighting for universal suffrage, that all women would be getting the vote, and African American men as well. And it didn't work out that way. The Constitution was amended, and in the 15th Amendment, they did not include the word gender, which would have incorporated women to enable them to have the vote. There are some arguments by some that the Constitution is otherwise can be read to, that women could have fought for the vote based on that, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton tried it and failed. And I'm pleased to say that ultimately, after this very long schism, the groups did come back together, which is really, really important. In 1870, Lucy Stone and her husband began publishing the Women's Journal newspaper, and they gave information and communication about their organization. It celebrated women's achievements in other fields as well, and it was published for 50 years. In 1879, the Massachusetts legislature voted to allow women to vote for school committee. And this was at the first annual election for school committee. About 5,000 women in Massachusetts became registered voters. The interesting debate that had happened was they were trying to get the vote, and they would not agree to give them the full vote. And then the thinking was, well, if women and mothers are taking care of their children and they're in charge of their education, maybe it makes some sense for them to get to vote for the school committee that's going to oversee their education. So that was the way that they were able to get to be able to vote. It was their first voting opportunity that they were given. And it happened in some other parts of the country as well. But that was very important. I would like to talk a little bit about Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin. She lived from 1893 to 1894 because there are so many women. Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin was from here in Massachusetts, an African-American woman. She and many, many others are so important to the suffrage movement, and yet we don't know much about them. And I have to say, there's often discussion about why don't we know about these people, and I think there's a long answer about that or a short one, but unfortunately we know so little about so many of them. So this evening I'm trying to highlight a few if I can. Please know there are many, many, many more for us all to learn about. Some of them are on our panels and on our website, but there are more and more and more. And please let me know of some that you may come up with, because we're expanding our list, and our list of suffragists that we're doing for these panels, that's a list that we're continuing. We have almost another year to go, and we have plenty to do, but if there are more names that we need to be sure to include, we absolutely would love to hear about that, so please do let us know. So Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin, her family was in Boston, and they had a Boston clothing business and had a pretty good middle-class living. She was sent to school as a child in Salem to avoid segregation in the Boston schools. She returned to Boston schools in 1855 when the schools were integrated. And of course, we know that may have happened for some period of time, but certainly not forever. She went to finishing school and had private tutoring. Her husband, George Lewis Ruffin, was the first African American to graduate from Harvard Law School and the first to become a judge in the northern states. After her husband passed away, she worked with her friend Mariah Baldwin, who I also want to talk about, and together they formed the Women's Era Club for women of color in Boston in 1893. It was not limited to black women, but emphasized the improvement in life for black citizens, and they also focused on anti-lynching and on suffrage as well. There was an incident that's famous about Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin when she attended a women's club convention in Milwaukee, and she had her membership badge ripped off of her because she was an African American and told that she could not participate. And that made national news, with most people supporting the idea that she should have been allowed to participate. And that's just one example of where African American women were not included by white women in their efforts, which is horrible and terrible. And to their credit, the African American women pursued anyway having women get the vote. And they had to do it separately, which was most unfortunate. But luckily they did that, and were extremely helpful in the women's movement for the vote as well. So with Lucy Stone and Julia Ward Howe, they founded the Boston-based Women's Suffrage Association, and that's with Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin. After women could vote for school committee in 1879, she also promoted women voting and women running for office, was something that Josephine St. Pierre was really in favor of. And in 1895, she organized the first conference of black women in Boston in 1895. In 1910, she was a founding member of the NAACP Boston branch, and I'm very pleased that this past summer for Women's Equality Day, Suffrage100MA had an event, which we do annually near the Swan Boats, and we honored, we called it Sheroes, African American women of Massachusetts who were suffragists. And we honored Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin, and the person who unveiled her panel is Tanisha Sullivan, who is the current head of the NAACP here in Boston. So that was very special as well. And our other panels were about Sojourner Truth and Mariah Baldwin. Mariah Baldwin lived from 1856 to 1922. She was an educator. She was from Cambridge. She became principal of the Gassey School, and what was so interesting about that was most of her students were white, and that was amazing to have a black woman who was promoted to be the head of the school over a school that was predominantly white students. She improved mathematics education, established parent-teacher groups, and introduced the position of nurse in the school, which I also found extremely interesting, that was a new idea to have a nurse in the school. She spoke at the 25th annual banquet of the New England and Massachusetts Suffrage Association at Faneuil Hall. That was in 1900. W.E. Du Bois spoke at her home often, and E.E. Cummings was one of her students and spoke admirably of her. Trying to move us along chronologically if I can, one of the amazing things about this is this effort that was going on state by state by state to get the vote, because it wasn't happening nationally, is that by 1900, even up until 1910, the states that had had adopted suffrage for women were all west of the Mississippi. They were out west. Wyoming was first, even before it was a state, they gave women the vote. But it's so interesting, I think, that no states east of the Mississippi, which we might have thought would be sort of more progressive, but not at all, they were in the west. One of the reasons, not the only one, was that they didn't have enough women living out west. They wanted to attract more women to come west. So it was sort of, oh, you want the vote? We'll give you the vote, come on out, trying to attract them to come move west. But it was pretty amazing that if you data from 1848 with the Seneca Falls Convention, which was the first organized meeting, if you will, a movement that came out of 1848 to ask for the vote as a group, up until 1900, that's 52 years. And they had a handful of states, I think it was 8, not many at all. So I will talk for a moment. For those of you, if you get to 1912, I'm going to bring in some movies in case any of you were able to see the movie Suffragette, which takes place around 1912, and it's the British story about what it took to get the vote, which was very, very difficult there, and they had been at it for decades, and there were suffragists. Maybe some of you have heard the term suffragist, ISTS, and suffragette, and wondered, what's the difference? Why one? And the answer is, to some extent, in England, they were all suffragists, but when this group of women who were led by Emmeline Pankhurst and her daughter Christabel and Annabel, she had 2 daughters, very active, she was in favor of deeds, not words, were her famous phrase, because she believed enough. We have been trying to do it calmly and peaceably, it's not working. And they did become much more violent and started blowing up buildings and throwing rocks, and it was very dangerous. They tried to be very careful. I believe no one died in any of the incidents where they blew up buildings, but it was more violent. And the newspapers dubbed them the suffragettes to try to make fun of them. But they decided to embrace it and say, fine, call us the suffragettes. So that's where you get the suffragette movement over in England. In the States, they were historically the suffragists. The switch that happened a little, and they still are, generally called the suffragists. In the movie Suffragette, which I highly, highly recommend because it's a wonderful movie about the effort in England, through the eyes of a poor woman who she wasn't setting out to get the vote, just trying to live. She worked in a laundry factory. It was horrible conditions. She was poor, and you learn a lot about the common law that was in Britain, which is also our common law, and it's very, very painful. There were 2 Americans who were there at the time during Suffragette. They are not depicted, but they were there, and they had joined the effort. One of them is Alice Paul, someone who I had not grown up knowing about, but oh my gosh, Alice Paul was so critical to our movement here for the vote. And another woman, Lucy Burns. The 2 of them met in jail in England, in the Holloway jail, I believe. And Alice Paul is from New Jersey. She was a Quaker and had grown up going to suffrage meetings with her mom, and also was highly educated. She had several degrees, I believe a PhD from the University of Pennsylvania, but wanted more, went to England to study social work, and at her school ended up going to hear a speech by, I think it was Christabel Pankhurst. And when she went there, by the way, she rode her bike at night. It was hard to get there, but she was interested. She wanted to go there, bless you. And so she went and heard this speech, and it spoke to her. And one of the things that happened was how the speaker was jeered, and fruit was thrown at the speaker, and she was outraged at the behavior and that women couldn't speak in that way. So she became a part of the movement in England and became quite a leader, actually, and under the tutelage of Emmeline Pankhurst, and ended up being jailed quite a bit and could withstand going to jail and going on hunger strikes, and then being force-fed because the government didn't want to have martyrs on their hands. She came back to the States with Lucy Burns, and they encountered now what you could call the old guard. I talked about how long Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony had run these organizations. Carrie Chapman Catt, a spectacular suffragist from here in this country, was now running this along with Anna Howard Shaw, who spent time in Dennis and the Cape Cod, so another Massachusetts person. They were now in charge, if you will, and very leery of Alice Paul arriving from England, having been a part of this much more violent group of suffragists, and sometimes called the suffragettes. Alice Paul promised, I will not be violent. She used peaceful means, but they were more aggressive. And one of the first things she did, which was amazing, was she organized a parade. I think she came to the States in around November of 1912. March 3rd, 1913, was when Woodrow Wilson had been elected president, a Democrat. And remember that it was many of the Republicans who had been more supportive of suffrage and so forth. But a Democrat had been elected to office, and his inauguration was in March. Now, we're used to today, inaugurations for president are in January. This was March. He arrives at Union Station with his wife, expecting to be greeted by throngs of people. Nobody's there. And he says, where is everybody? Why aren't they greeting me? I'm your new president. And the answer was, oh, they're over at the women's parade. And there were thousands. Alice Paul was brilliant and her group because she realized, well, all these people are going to come to Washington, D.C. for this inauguration. Let's have a parade. They'll come join us, which meant that there were supporters and there were antis. Incredible parade, and if you think about the organization of what it takes to run a parade, you have to line people up, you have to know where your floats are and what you're doing, and it was an incredible, incredible parade. And as they walked, everything was fine until some of the men and boys started throwing things at the women, and pandemonium broke out, and they were hurting them, and the police literally turned their backs and did not protect the women. Initially, the reaction was that, and about 100 women ended up in the hospital being injured at this parade, and it did get front page coverage, which Alice Paul was very happy about. Well, we're finally in the news again. And some of the old guard was concerned about that, yet it's also, I also understand that both sides were so outraged that the police had not defended them, that there were studies and research that they did for many months going forward to look into why did the police not protect these women, that it was horrible that they had not done that. So that was in March of 1913. It was a big deal, and it was very, very helpful. And it was the first time that there had ever been a parade with a political purpose. We can think of a July 4th parade or Memorial Day parade or other things to commemorate those dates, but this parade had a purpose, and it was for women to achieve the vote. And this is the one where I mentioned that the Massachusetts delegation included a poster here, or the likeness of our Massachusetts women. So in this effort to get the vote, that was 1912, and this issue of going state by state, I want to talk about Boston and Massachusetts a little bit. So we're up to, say, 1914, 1915. Massachusetts did not have the vote. I'm sorry to say, I believe Massachusetts may have been one of the first states where the anti-suffrage movement took hold here and grew, and it was very, very powerful. You may recall, by basis of comparison, in January of 2017, for the Women's March, many of you may have been there at the Women's March on Boston Common, there were about 175,000 people. It was a big crowd, 175,000 people. In 1915, there was a parade planned just preceding the vote. A vote on women being able to vote in Massachusetts was scheduled for November of 1915. In October 1915, there was a parade in Back Bay, and there was half the population from what we have today, but 500,000 people marched in Boston to get the vote. And the year before, in 1914 and 1915, there were 200,000 to 300,000 people marching, and it was a parade with floats and a stand and so forth. There were women at every corner with red roses, which indicated they were opposed to suffrage, so the opposition was out as well. What was so tragic was that 1 month after that enormous parade, and you can imagine the organizers were thrilled. My gosh, they had 500,000 people and 10 to 15,000 marchers. It's an enormous crowd. It was defeated at the ballot box, and it was defeated overwhelmingly. It was like 60% to 30%. That's an approximate number, but it was overwhelmingly defeated, which must have been devastating for the women and the men who had worked so hard towards that. Another thing, so there were efforts going on to still try to get both state by state and a constitutional amendment, and Alice Paul she created the National Women's Party. And that's really where these colors come from, purple, white, and gold. In Britain, it was purple, white, and green. One of the things that was so amazing about the suffragists, I think, is how they knew about what we would call branding. And they made sure that when women went out and marched, they told them, it's like an army. You're going to war. Like the men who march in uniform and they all look alike and you know they're a soldier, wear your white. Look the same so that everybody can identify you as a suffragist. It was very important. It was amazing. And then the colors from Britain, they borrowed the purple and white. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony liked They discovered the sunflower when they were in Kansas years before, and so gold started coming into the United States. And when Alice Paul did the National Women's Party, it became these colors. New York, which had a strong link to England, they had often purple, white, and green. So there were colors going on, but branding, I think, is the most important thing in it, and it worked quite a bit. One of the things that happened in January of 1917, Alice Paul did the second thing that I would say that was unbelievable, very unique, and that was she decided, and with her friends, there were others involved in this decision as well, to picket the White House. They were the first people ever to picket the White House, were the suffragists. They came up with this idea, which was not violent, it was passive, but they were doing more aggressive things to get the word out, if you will. And they were there 6 days a week for 2.5 years until the adoption by Congress of the 19th Amendment. Over 2,000 women were silent sentinels over that time period. As I said, 6 days a week, all kinds of weather, hot, cold, rain, snow, sleet, everything. At some point, finally, they were not aggressive, but they ended up being arrested. And particularly when war broke out, a few months after they had started picketing, the question was, would they picket a sitting president? And in those days, that was like, oh, picketing a sitting president, everybody's supposed to come together and support your president, the fact that they weren't. But these women felt like, excuse me, we are overseas fighting for freedom and democracy, and we don't have it here. Women don't have the vote, yet we must live under the laws of this government that we have no say in, and felt so strongly about that. That's when the picketing was happening, and they had various signs that got pretty strident against the president, asking, and the famous one is, when will we have liberty? How long must we wait for liberty? One interesting thing is the last women in the country jailed who were arrested and jailed for the vote were right here in Boston, Massachusetts. On February 24, 1919, Woodrow Wilson had gone to Europe for peace negotiations at the end of the war. He was coming back to the United States. I believe he thought about going to New York and heard he would be met by all these suffragists, so he said, I'll go to Boston. So he comes to Boston and he docks, and who meets his boat? Alice Paul. She comes up from Washington, she meets his boat, she's got a National Women's Party group has formed here, and when they had a parade in February in Boston, there was a parade for Woodrow Wilson, there were a group of picketers, and they were arrested and jailed at the Charles Street Jail, and they were the last women jailed for the vote. They also lit fires over barrels lighting his speeches, and those women were jailed as well. They were on the Boston Common. For women who had survived jail, similar when I talked about wearing white and being in a uniform color that everyone would recognize you, the other thing that the suffragists in England thought about actually was that these women should be decorated. They have survived jail. They have survived force feeding as these horrible conditions. So when they came out, they would give a ceremony for them, and I'm wearing a jail door pin. They awarded them pins. Sort of like when men came back from war, they might get ribbons and be decorated for their service, and they wanted these women to be decorated as well. This is just one example. There are others that did involve women, but the jail door pin became very famous and important. And in Washington, when Alice Paul survived the Night of Terror, which was this horrible, horrible night at the Occoquan jailhouse, which they're trying to rebuild now and turn into a wonderful monument, she survived, and they had a ceremony for her. And the women who survived jail here in Boston, they had a ceremony here in Boston for them to award them pins. And so these were worn proudly by women who had survived this horrible treatment. So June 4, 1919, finally the 19th Amendment is adopted by Congress. So you had February 1919, women being arrested in Boston. By June, it's adopted by Congress finally, and then it goes to the states for ratification. So state by state by state for ratification. But all that work trying to get the states to ratify meant there had made progress within the states, and it helped them as they worked for ratification. Massachusetts, by this point, had turned around from 1915, where they said, no, now you're in 1919. 8th state to ratify the constitutional amendment, and we just had a wonderful event at Faneuil Hall to honor and commemorate that 100th anniversary. If you're interested, that's on our website to look at pictures and all the wonderful speakers and so forth that we had, and some who were in costume, in wonderful costume. So that was, but Massachusetts didn't get the vote. It meant that we were adding Massachusetts to the list of states. 36 were needed to have it added to the Constitution. Similar, if you will, to the ERA, and I'll talk about that quickly in just a moment. So you get up to, now it's going state by state by state. It didn't go as quickly as they wanted. You go all the way to August. You've got states that have said yes, and there are 35 states that have said yes. You've got several states that have said no. There are, I believe, about 3 states that hadn't yet decided, but the only one where there was a chance turned out to be Tennessee, where the governor was convinced, and I believe Woodrow Wilson did put in a call to him, to bring it to a vote. Carrie Chapman Catt went out to Tennessee thinking she might stay for about a week to try to push for this, and she ended up there for 2 months, I believe. The lobbying was unbelievable. There are many, many books I can recommend that you read, and they're on our website. The one about this is The Woman's Hour by Elaine Weiss. Fabulous book. But what was amazing was the lobbying that was going on by the liquor industry, who were opposed to women getting the vote because they felt that they were supporting prohibition, which had now been adopted, but they were opposed to it. The railroad industry was opposed to women getting the vote. There were concerns that if women got the vote, they would institute all these labor laws, and they were not interested in that happening. So it was horrible. There was money flying, literally, and part of the story is that it comes down to one vote. There were other pieces that it wasn't exactly one vote, but at one point it did. At the very end, the House had adopted it. They're now in the Senate. If you are opposed to women getting the vote, you wear a red rose. If you're in favor, you wear yellow. 24-year-old Harry Byrne is in the legislature on the floor. He's wearing his red rose. And he came in, and the suffragists were really frustrated. They had talked to him. They thought he was going to be supportive, but he was wearing a red rose. And the vote is happening, and there were many different votes going on that affected all this. And when he sat down, a page came over and delivered a letter to him, and it was from his mother. And his mother wrote him a note encouraging him to vote for suffrage. And he put it in his pocket, and he did change his vote. And that is how it was adopted by Tennessee, and finally the 36th state was added. Pandemonium broke out. Nobody expected him to vote yes. The suffragists had hoped he would. They had given up hope, and yet he did, and we are very thankful to his mother for putting him over the top with that, which was great. I will mention that, and then it took until August 26th. Actually, it was in the middle of the night. I think the Secretary of State signed and added the 19th Amendment to the Constitution. August 26th is the anniversary. And when Bella Abzug was in Congress, she designated August 26th as Women's Equality Day. And so that's one of the reasons we celebrate and commemorate on August 26th for women's suffrage. I will mention that Alice Paul went on in 1923 with her friends also to write the Equal Rights Amendment. So the Equal Rights Amendment was written in 1923. She lived until, I believe, 1977, and she saw it finally get passed, but it had been introduced for years, and she was living and working in Washington, D.C. in a home now called the Belmont Paul Women's Equality Monument. It's where she worked for decades and produced, I think, about 600 pieces of legislation. I feel like there are so many more stories I'd like to tell you, but I see the time is getting short, so I'm going to wrap it up, and I'm happy to take any questions, if I will. Thank you so much.
I thought maybe, Freddie, you might know more about this than I do, but the Equal Rights Amendment, now we think it might pass because of the switch in the legislature in Virginia. I don't know if you know any more details about that and the timeline.
No, only that. First of all, it's huge that the legislature in Virginia has passed, because that is a state which we do hope now that the Equal Rights Amendment will pass. I think the challenge is that that amendment, the Equal Rights Amendment, and I believe Prohibition may be the only two amendments that have included language in them that had a deadline. And the constitutionality of that deadline has not been decided. And the concern is that if they do pass it, which is great, whether it would pass constitutional muster. And so one would hope that it would, and certainly there's an argument that it should be adopted immediately, but one can imagine that there could be people who would fight that. And that would be tragic, but it's possible. You give me an opportunity to mention a group called the Yellow Roses. The Suffrage Celebration Coalition, our Suffrage100MA, is a nonprofit, nonpartisan group with about 94 partners as of this week. And one of them is called the Yellow Roses, and those are high school girls from Quincy who actually watched the movie Iron-Jawed Angels. And when I spoke about Alice Paul, I encourage you, there are many, many books about her and this incredible movie called Iron-Jawed Angels. And these girls saw the movie, came up to their teacher, the wonderful Ron Adams, and said, what can we do, what can we do? And they organized the Yellow Roses, and they are fighting for the Equal Rights Amendment. Yeah, which is great, yes.
Hi, I was quite fascinated by the idea that women started voting here in 1879 for school committee, which I did not know. Did they keep voting all the way up to 1920 when they got the right to vote, so that was continuous?
I believe it was. I believe it was. But they could only vote in school committee, but I believe they did.
Okay, I think that's remarkable. I did not know that. I was just kind of curious if they were ever able to expand that to whether it was city council or town meetings and boards of selectmen, so that they could begin to creep beyond a school committee.
I don't believe so. I'm not 100% sure, but I believe it was limited to school committee, again with this notion that it was tied to the children, that they were in charge of the children and could do that. And you give me the opportunity. I believe it was Mariah Baldwin, the woman I spoke of from Cambridge. Mm-hmm. I think she was the first woman in Massachusetts to register to vote, as I recall, once it came through.
I wonder if you want to talk a bit about what happened after 1920 to women who were not allowed to vote.
Thank you for the question. I appreciate it very much. And I did mean to talk about that. So the biggest issue was primarily in the South, that there were African American women in the North who were voting, and some who ran for office. But the limitation for African American women was in the South with Jim Crow laws, because that's where they could try to vote and were prohibited from doing so because of all the barriers that were put up by the Jim Crow laws. And it really wasn't until the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that really addressed that and made a major difference. And unfortunately, we know those laws are under attack today. And so that access to voting is something that continues to be of concern in those states. And it's affecting so many people. So it's really important that we're vigilant about what's happening in many states, particularly with the diminishment of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The other thing I will mention is other groups where Asian Americans were prohibited from voting in this country until much later. Native Americans were not considered citizens until later into the 1900s. And certainly you make me think of Ida B. Wells, one of the fabulous suffragist who was an African-American woman who worked for years and years and years against lynching. And she was at the March Parade in 1913 and was told that she had to march in the back. And she insisted on marching with her Illinois delegation, and she just slipped in and did it, which was wonderful. There are so many sheroes and heroes for us to learn about and celebrate, and I feel badly we can't talk about all of them, so there are more and more and more. Please, I hope, if anything, this has encouraged you to explore more about these people. On our website, we have a wonderful category called Resources and a wonderful toolkit that Ann Borg put together that's terrific, and I encourage you all to read that and our events page and so forth, and I'm happy to answer any other questions.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All
Thank you
right.
very much.